Trainers. Something many cyclists have a troubled relationship with, but have, with the development of virtual training platforms in recent years, become something more than just a necessary evil, sometimes even an enjoyable experience in their own right. I must admit that I felt some reluctance towards getting back into turbo this winter, but after a few fairly atrocious rides outside, I remembered why I prefer to spend time with the company of spiders in the shed. Since I love hills, I've always been curious about in-game climbing dynamics and how they compare to the real world. So in this video, I'll be delving into various virtual platforms and taking a look at it both from a subjective and more scientific perspective. My life is very exciting, thanks for asking. As a disclaimer, I'm kind of stupid, so please bear with any terminology errors and the like, of which I'm sure there's many. So first of all, I looked at the three main racing platforms, Zwift, IndieVelo, and MyWhoosh. I'll talk about them more in depth as we go along, but for the sake of this experiment, I found a climb that could be more or less replicated on the three platforms, and then I tried to ride it at the same power. For these first three, I kept the trainer difficulty relatively low just to try and make sure my power was consistent. And then I took the results and modelled them against an algorithm that calculated the real-life watts I'd hypothetically have to do to ride at the same speed if I were out on a real road. So the first one here is, of course, Zwift, and we're heading up Box Hill. Zwift is obviously the dominating force in the virtual world. Lots of experiments have been conducted in regards to its real-life accuracy, and I think it's pretty widely accepted that Zwift is very generous when it comes to not just climbing, but all aspects of riding dynamics. I did an Alpe de Zwift and Alpe d'Huez comparison last year, and my time up Alpe de Zwift was about 10% faster than Alpe d'Huez, despite putting out 3% less watts. So we all know that Zwift likes to make things easy for us, which I suppose is fine, and it probably entices users, like it makes virtual climbs a bit less of a slog for those that don't enjoy them. And most of the elements that make climbing fun, such as that feeling of vertical progress, don't exist when you're just stationary pedaling. So maybe it doesn't really matter. But I'll be lying if I said I haven't got a bit frustrated when I just got immediately dropped up climbs in Zwift racing. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than just your power. There's racecraft and even just like the ability to maximize your trainer efficiency. There seems to be this style that a lot of the top Zwift racers have adopted, where you're kind of really far over the handlebars and almost running on the pedals. Certainly a style of riding that wouldn't necessarily translate to climbing well in the real world. So there's definitely an element of that which results in me struggling at places where I should be doing well, but there still seems to be something a bit off about the dynamics. I remember doing a race on the Innsbruck course and just having to chase back on every lap after the leg snapper, which is a really short, like little punchy climb, less than a minute, but it does kick up fairly steep, and we were just flying up there at like 30 miles an hour, which I can tell you from racing in the real world does not happen. Yeah, because with like this kind of generosity provided by Zwift, a 10% hill becomes more like a 5% one, thus decreasing the advantage of climbers. Then of course the climb also takes less climb, so a more punchy effort is required. But anyway, it doesn't really matter, it just means that you have to approach climbs differently than you would perhaps in real life. But anyway, back to this effort. I just did Box Hill without the flat bit at the top, and rode at a hard but repeatable pace, trying to keep the effort consistent. I also don't know why I have a pro badge. I've never been professional, and I do have to pay full membership. I definitely don't think I'll be getting anything for free after hurling insults at Zwift here. So this climb was about 261 watts at 5.3 watts per kilogram. So if we look at the comparison with the algorithm we're using for reference, the calculations aren't perfect as it's not taking into account things like momentum, which explains the random spikes you can see when there's a bit of a flatter section. It's just computing roughly the watts you'd have to deploy to go a given speed on a given gradient. But it provides a general baseline that you can use to plot various rides against, and use to see how the various platforms differ in their calculations. So it's pretty similar to my Alpe de Zwift experiment last year. So the dark blue line is gradient multiplied by 10, so it's easier to see. The red line is the power recorded by Zwift, and the yellow line is the power I would supposedly have to do in order to go the speed I went on Zwift. So clearly there's a really obvious difference there. Looks like I'd have to go about 290 watts in real life versus the 260 watts I did in game. So kind of confirming what we already knew there. But this on its own isn't that meaningful, but it'll be interesting when we compare it to the next few platforms. Regardless of the stats, you can get a sense of what I'll call false speed just by looking at the screen. My avatar is tanking along at fairly meagre watts. Granted, Box Hill isn't a very steep climb, but 25 kilometers an hour is a tad optimistic. I'm sure just about everyone is familiar with Zwift, so I don't need to delve too much into the riding experience. But I suppose because it's so gamified, it feels more acceptable to be going unrealistically fast. Some of the platforms we'll look at later use real-life video footage, so that's kind of a different ballpark. Some of the more serious climbs on Zwift are still really hard work, especially if you ride at a high trainer difficulty. In 2020, I did a virtual Everest on Alpe d'Huez and then topped one top. One of the requirements is that you have to put trainer difficulty on 100%, and it really does result in a different ride feel. I prefer it if I'm trying to simulate real climbing, but if you're just riding around, it can be a real pain to change gears constantly. Also because in real life you're more able to sense and anticipate pictures in the road, whereas it can be a bit tricky when you're just looking at a screen. So I find myself changing gears either too often or too late. So generally I don't keep it super high, but I like to crank it up if I'm trying to replicate a proper hill effort up on top or something. Although the radio tower is kind of a horrific grinder on high trainer difficulty. As a side note, I don't know if this is just me, but my legs literally change shape over the winter when I'm doing most of my riding on the trainer. I guess I just sit and pedal slightly differently due to the static nature of it, but I get sore in completely different places. I've fallen back into the habit of standing up a lot too, and riding at a lower cadence, especially when I get tired. It's not really something I want to be doing, but it just feels easier to squeeze out the power. I'm also aware that I'm approaching this from a perspective that most people don't care about. Like, I'm sitting here pedaling a video game in my shed. Does it really matter if I'm going a few miles an hour faster than I would in the real world? But in these UK winters, lots of us tally up an awful lot of hours on our trainers, and it's just something I've always noticed and been curious about. So yeah, this is all just a bit of fun, and to be honest, I'm often quite grateful for the little morale boost we get from bonus speed. So that was the end of the Zwift segment. The other ones, thankfully, won't be quite as long, as I haven't used the platforms long enough to rack up a long list of complaints yet. But we'll come back to the stats from this ride for some comparisons. Okay, so next up is IndieVelo. The first thing of note is that I'm looking pretty snazzy in my outfit there. So IndieVelo is probably unfamiliar to most people, but it's quietly picking up momentum in the esports racing scene. It's still in beta mode, and it was developed by the people who used to lead Zeta, so there's a big focus on credibility and accuracy. It's currently free to use, but I don't imagine it will be for that much longer. They do claim they use real-world physics, not just in terms of speed, but also cornering and braking features. And I've not done any racing on here yet, but have done some just general riding, and it's been pretty enjoyable to use. The developers are transparent in what they're trying to do, and the features they're implementing, so it's been a good user experience in my limited use of it so far, but of course I can't really talk since I haven't actually raced on it yet. The interface looks relatively similar to Zwift. Most of the other riders you can see are bots, and dual recording is also native to the game, so it automatically picks up your power meter as well. I actually quite like the graphics, even though it does venture into uncanny valley territory. But despite most of the scenery being pretty similar, it has an element of realism to it that makes it fairly engaging. The one downside is that there's very limited routes and hills to choose at the moment, so this is one of the longest I found, which is the Northern Hill Climb. It's about 2.4 kilometers at 6%, so relatively similar to Box Hill, and I tried to ride at the same sort of effort. You can see that they show the wind direction and strength in the upper right. It was very low and changed direction throughout this hill, so it shouldn't have had much or really any bearing on my speed. So looking at the results, I did 257 watts for just under 7 minutes, and here's a look at the graph. So if you ignore those little spiky sections which occurred when the gradient dropped, and just focus on the sections when we were riding on a consistent gradient, you can see that on the whole it's much closer than Zwift was. So regardless of whether or not it's perfectly accurate to the real world, we know it's definitely closer than Zwift is. Not really surprising, and you can kind of get a sense of this just by pedaling around. I'll definitely be curious to try a few races to see what that's like, and if there are some longer climbs built into the world, I'll definitely be interested in giving them a go. The last platform for the first part of this video is MyWhoosh, another one I've done a bit of general riding on, but not any racing yet. Unlike IndieVelo, MyWhoosh has a vast array of routes, including some pretty huge climbs, although they've recently introduced limits on world availability, so you can't always access them. A bit annoying, but it's not completely a bad thing. There aren't a huge amount of users, so the chances of coming across a non-bot is pretty minimal when there's so many roads available. With the exception of the avatar, which tends to display some peculiar cycling technique, I really like the world graphics. I'm not so keen on the display. It's kind of hard to know where you are on a given route, but I'm sure it's something you'd adjust to with time. Another thing is you can see that the road surface is changing. It's kind of like this gravel, sandy texture. I'm not sure if that's taken into account, like Zwift obviously applies higher rolling resistance. Yeah, I'm not sure how that influences things and if it even has any bearing on things. And I found another climb similar to the previous two. So I used the first part of Heritage Climb. Turned out there's a bit of a descent in it, which threw things off, so we'll just look at the first section of it, which is just under 2 kilometers at 6%, which I did at about 255 watts. Before reviewing anything, I could tell that things were feeling a bit weird on this climb, much pitchier than anticipated based on my previous assessment of the climb. And looking at the data, it's apparent that the elevation track that MyWhoosh uses is extremely inconsistent. The gradient has these constant micro pitches, more so than was actually tangible in-game, so whether or not it actually means much for the user experience is debatable, but overall it definitely felt less smooth and just generally harder than Zwift or IndieVelo. It also did feel that on these little plateaus you pick up speed much faster than you realistically would, which would also account for the really excessive spikes in the graph. So to summarise things in ranking of climbing difficulty, we've got Zwift easiest, then IndieVelo, and then MyWhoosh. But that doesn't necessarily mean that MyWhoosh is the most accurate, as it probably felt the weirdest of the three. And I'll say that IndieVelo, just based on sensations and having a look at this, just a general look at this data, I think IndieVelo is probably the most accurate. Initially I was just going to do these first 3 racing platforms, but you know how it is. So this next section features apps that have a focus on recreating real-world routes, so Rouvy, BKool and FulGaz. For these comparisons I did something a little different. I found a climb that was available on all 3 platforms and found a nice consistent section. I used Cold Aspen, which I rode in real life over the summer, so I aimed to ride at the power I did for that section, just for a little extra point of comparison. And I also kept the trainer difficulty at full, so 100% for these efforts. So first up is Rouvy, and I actually really enjoyed my first experience riding on Rouvy. Check me out. Looking pretty cool. Unfortunately my name was taken, so I had to be a bit more creative. But that's okay, because we all know I'm reputed for my relentlessly cheerful demeanour. It initially looks a bit odd with an avatar overlaid on real life footage, but it didn't take long to get used to, and you can also choose to ride with other bots, but I got rid of those. Watching real footage is a very different experience from the more gamified platforms, but I find climbing much more rewarding, especially if you ride at full trainer difficulty. You can sort of fool yourself into feeling like you're actually climbing, and it's easier to sit back and settle into a rhythm. The footage speeds up based on the power you're putting out. Of course, even riding at full trainer difficulty, you'll never get the same sensation at riding on an actual climb, even if you're spinning away in the same gears, since you're not actually pushing against a real gradient. It often feels harder because your legs kind of get stuck in this dead spot in your pedal stroke, where it feels like all the resistance is dumped. Partially psychological, I'm sure, but on the whole it felt smooth, and visually it felt like the footage was moving along at the right sort of speed. Also enjoyed seeing the views that weren't too visible when I actually rode it. So first we can just quickly compare it to my real life ride. So this segment's about 2.4 kilometers at 6%. In the summer I rode 234 watts, 12.1 miles an hour, so it took a little under 7.5 minutes. Of course there was some real life weather factors at play. There was a decent breeze, and there's a hairpin in this course, so I think the point where I changed direction, the wind also changed. But yeah, just for a rough kind of comparison. So on Rouvy I did 239 watts, which was 12.7 miles an hour and took just under 7 minutes. So just from glancing at that, it's actually looking pretty decent compared to real life. We can't look into these comparisons too much, as I was using a different power meter and whatnot, but it's enough to see that it's relatively reflective of what you would expect in the real world. And then if we compare it to the good old algorithm against the computed watts, ignoring once again that bit of a dip, it's looking pretty solid. Cold Aspen is actually one of the climbing portals on Zwift. Originally I wasn't planning on doing these real climb experiments, so maybe I missed the trick there, but I'm definitely not the biggest fan of the climbing portals. I find them a bit boring, and also the gradient I remember on Cold Aspen was just really completely all over the place. So all in all, it's quite a fun climb on Rouvy, and I shall certainly be using my free trial. Next up is BKool, and this was a somewhat hilarious experience.
Oh my, what the hell is this? What?
Now, a lot of this is down to the fact that I didn't properly research the platform or get familiar with it. I just kind of downloaded it, found the Aspen course and headed off. So you can probably put a lot of the weird stuff that went on down to user error. I seemed to create an event which had a built-in warm-up feature, which I do kind of like the idea of. I believe it gives you the option to save that file separately, unlike Zwift. But yeah, I skipped that and suddenly this countdown started, which sent me into a panic. Even though the segment I was using for these comparisons doesn't actually start until 2 kilometers into the climb.
Is it? This looks like a total. What is this?
So it was immediately obvious that the resistance being applied was just crazy. I couldn't find the setting to adjust it either, which is kind of nice, but I could barely turn the pedals on a 6% gradient, so I dread to think what some of the steeper climbs would feel like. I don't know what GPS file this route was based off, but it was just crazy and pitching all over the place. I do have to say that it was quite entertaining though. I did notice that the watts per kilogram displayed weren't in line with the watts I was putting out. I did check afterwards that my weight was set correctly, which it was, but I'm wondering if it somehow didn't update in-game and was using some default value about 10 kilograms too heavy, which would somewhat account for the perceived difficulty. Although either way, there's definitely something wacky going on with the gradients. Frequently seeing double digits, which didn't exist in real life. But yeah, I still don't think 13% would result in 50 RPM. You can see how quickly you start spinning out when the gradient drops as well. So if we look at the data, so 241 watts, only 10.7 miles an hour, so it took over 8 minutes. Clearly quite different from both reality and also Rouvy. And here's the usual comparison, which as you can see is, yeah, well, it's not quite spot on. That's real. Unlike Rouvy and FulGaz, BKool doesn't use filmed footage, but builds 3D graphics based on reality. The graphics aren't brilliant, but it does feel surprisingly similar to the real-life thing, perhaps more so than Zwift versions of pre-existing roads, which take more creative liberties. There's also a route build feature where you can upload a GPX file, which is then recreated, so I'd be kind of interested to try that out. I'm not too sure I will though. So yeah, BKool, while not necessarily accurate or good, certainly provides a good option if you're looking for a fun roller coaster of a ride. Just be careful of your knees. The file then also got stuck for ages trying to save. So far, Rouvy was pretty groovy, BKool was not cool. Stuck on the spinning wheel of death. Will the activity save? Stay tuned to find out. Last but not least, we've got FulGaz, or FulGaz. For some reason the data on screen didn't record in the screen capture, so sorry about that. But FulGaz is basically the same as Rouvy, but it's a pure POV video, so no avatar. As you'd expect, this one feels the most similar to actually being out on the road. I've used it a little bit before, and it's probably the best option if you're just looking to explore a new climb, or even, this can be kind of funny, to ride climbs you actually know in real life. So this one works the same way as Rouvy in that the video speeds up and slows down based on the power you're putting out. It can be a bit weird when there's other riders or cars on screen and they start moving like in slow motion or really fast. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of traffic on the day that this clip was filmed. I'm not sure how that would affect the realism of it if the original rider was having to brake a lot. You can see that in the recorded data, the speed track is a bit all over the place. But regardless of how accurate it is, I find it quite a fun platform if you're just looking to, kind of go for a ride. It'd also be a good way of reconning a route if you are like doing a hill climb, you don't have time to pre-ride it. Something I found with platforms like Rouvy and FulGaz is that the downhills seem to be like over exaggerated. So if you're on like a negative 1% section, you might completely run out of gears, which obviously wouldn't happen in real life. But when climbing, it seems relatively realistic. Didn't have the problems like BKool seems to suffer from, where it really piles on the resistance. So looking at the results, it was 238 watts, so 13 miles an hour and just under 7 minutes. So while the averages are quite similar to Rouvy, we can see that the data is a bit choppier. The gradient data contained in the GPS track seems a bit jumpy, and I have to say it felt like less of a smooth ride than Rouvy. But I'm not sure how much of this is due to the slightly erratic riding style and braking that occurred with all the traffic in the original video. And I think it's probably the case that the FulGaz experience will be fairly dependent on the quality of the original video and data supplied. So this is just a singular example that you can't draw much conclusion from. So to summarise this section, it's pretty clear that BKool was a wild ride, but FulGaz is decent and Rouvy came out on top. They're all quite fun if you're looking to virtually explore some new roads and enjoy some nice scenery while cracking out some efforts, and all three platforms have a nice and varied catalogue of climbs and routes around the world to choose from. You'll be pleased to know we've nearly reached the end. So what did all of this prove? Nothing really, but I had a good time anyway. At the very least, hopefully it provided some insight into what to expect if you're thinking of trying another platform, as at the end of the day it all depends on what you're looking to get out of your indoor training. Hopefully all these free trials will tide us over until we can get back to some real mountains. Until then, ride on!